Hey everybody, it's Scott. I wanted to make a recording about Loftus and Pickrell and the Peterson Kaasa Loftus article at the same time. I know that we've already had an assignment due on Loftus and Pickrell. However, both of these articles, and there are just one of each for each comprehension paper, factor into the quiz that's coming up on Tuesday the 2nd. So I felt a special, I don't know what the word is, need to address both of them. They both have their own technical aspects, but I wanted to get to them in due course, even though the paper has already come and gone for Loftus and Pickrell. I deliberately did not record one for Loftus and Pickrell because I figured, well, it's just one article, and I want them to have some opportunity to read an article without my direct input, without my prejudicing the impression of it. I thought it was that lucid, this 21-year-old article, and I still feel that way, but there's some things I want to shore up to reinforce before the quizzes actually due. Of course, we have the idea of what it's about, this business with the lost in the mall technique, which has its own ethical complications. You can argue it has extreme deceit involved. It's not just the case that they're deceiving the participants. They're deceiving the participants with the help of family members, for Pete's sake. That's all. I've never heard of that, by the way. I've never heard of a proxy involved in a psychology experiment wherein deceit was involved. Honestly, I don't think I would be able to participate in something like that. I wouldn't want to be a participant, and I wouldn't want to be the experimenter. I think it just frankly takes it a little too far. I'm amazed how the families helped, frankly, and I can imagine the conversations that would have taken place later. So wait a minute, you told them that I definitely wasn't lost in the mall, and they essentially badgered me into trying to believe that I was, and that sort of thing. It just would have been just a little bit too unusual to be involved in. But on the other hand, it's not that Loftus and Pickrell did this on their own accord. They have to have IRB approval, and of course they did. So without further ado, let's just touch base on some of the finer aspects for the quiz. Most of the experimental research on distortion has involved deliberate attempts to change memory that actually was experienced. In this case, the significance of this was that it wasn't. And I haven't made much of a to-do about this, but let me just tell this story in about 1 minute. The genesis of a study like this came from the world of clinical psychology, wherein in the early 90s, really dating back to maybe 1987 or so, it was the case that many therapists were helping their clients conjure false memories of early life abuse, usually sexual abuse. When someone makes an allegation that they've been abused, it's not the case that we reflexively dismiss it, of course. However, in tandem with investigating claims with great diligence, it was also the case that during this period that when some clients would report anxiety about relationships, etc., their therapist had the prevailing tack of assuming that the abuse happened, and people often took the memory on out of whole cloth. Loftus and Pickrell took this idea and said, I wonder if we could have people take on a memory that is clearly false, demonstrably false by their family's testimony, as an extension of this line of research. And again, I want to be careful not to say that we assume that claims of that sort are false. Of course we don't believe that. But what we do like to do is also suggest, and this was in the zeitgeist of therapy back then, that these therapeutic approaches that assume that's true were also in error. And it was a bit of a crisis, I would say, between, 1991 and 95 or so, particularly during that brief window. So we've got this lost in the mall paradigm. And then one of the first cases of successful false memory implantation, a 14-year-old kid named Chris, was supplied with descriptions of 3 events that happened in Chris's childhood involving his mother, etc. But the false memory was introduced in a short paragraph, and it reminded him that he was lost at a particular shopping mall in Spokane. So we have this seed of things that have happened, and that short video told the rest of the story. A few weeks later, Chris was re-interviewed. He rated his memories on a scale from 1 to 11, and for 3 true memories, Chris gave ratings of 1, 10, and 5 for the false memory, and 8. So it suggested that he took on the false memory with some degree of realism. So with some methodological scrutiny, with some degree of rigor, Loftus and Pickrell launched this study. I suppose it was during the 1994 calendar year, and it was published in 95. A few noteworthy things. 3 males, 21 females, ranging from 18 to 53, completed everything. You'll notice that in both this study and the Peterson study, it's overwhelmingly female. That could be the case because college enrollment is that way these days, and also psychology majors particularly that might take part in this sort of study. Just can't be avoided. So we just assume no sex differences. Anywho, they were recruited by UW, which is in Seattle, I believe, and each student provided a pair of individuals, which included both a participant and their relative that knew something about them, their older relative, presumably. So, and of course, the younger member had to be 18 years of age. The relative had to be, again, knowledgeable about the participant, probably a parent. They knew about their entire lifespan, of course. Subjects, or we'd say participants these days, were mailed a 5-page booklet containing a cover letter with instructions. The booklet contained 4 short stories, 3 of which actually happened. And we know this because we got the short stories from the parent. In actuality, 3 of the stories were true. The order of the events in the booklet and in the subsequent interviews was always the same, with the false memory about getting lost in the mall always third. Each event was described in a single paragraph, and then the participant could record the details of his or her memory later. To exemplify a false memory approach, here's one created for a 20-year-old student that was around the Washington area, Seattle area. You, your mom, and a couple of relatives went to the Bremerton Kmart. You must have been 5 at the time. Your mom gave us some money to get an icy. You ran ahead to get in line first and somehow lost your way. The brother or sister found you crying to an elderly Chinese woman. Then you went together to get an icy. So it was rather lengthy shoring up, if you would, and the details were provided spontaneously. Here's the procedure. Interviews with the relative, the parent presumably, for each subject were conducted to obtain 3 events that happened to the participant between the very young ages of 4 and 6. The stories were not to be family folklore or traumas that the subject will remember easily or find painful to remember. So we had to glom this from the older relative, the parent. The false events always included the following elements: lost for a good while, crying, lost in a mall or large department store about the age of 5, found and aided by an elderly woman, and reunited with the family. Okay, at the beginning of the first interview, participants were reminded about each of the 4 events one at a time. The third one was false, and asked to recall as much as they could about each of them. They were instructed to tell us everything they remembered, whether or not they had already written the information in their booklets. We told participants we were interested in examining how much detail they could remember and how their memories compared with those of their relative. The event paragraphs were not read to them verbatim, but rather bits of them were provided as cues. When the participants had recalled as much as possible, they were asked to rate, and here are the 2 dependent variables: the clarity of their memory for that event on a scale of 1 to 10 for each of the 4 memories, and also the confidence, about how confident they were that they were holding the correct memory. So clarity and confidence were the 2 dependent variables. The second interview session, 1 to 2 weeks after the first, was the same. Participants tried to remember the 4 events. They rated their clarity and confidence. But at the end of this session, when in effect it was over, the debriefing happened. What is debriefing? Essentially, we're telling the truth. You were not lost in the mall. We know that because your mom and dad or someone told us. And now we have to explain why that deception was done. And then, of course, we have to apologize, which had to be awkward as heck. We went through this elaborate ruse, and but nevertheless, it was necessary for the research. And by the way, deception is considered to be necessary, but I would have had reservations about this one because of the tremendous length and because of recruiting a partner to help deceive the participant has got to be somewhat unusual. Anyway, here are the results. 24 participants were asked to remember a total of 72 true events. Where does that come from? 24 times 3. 3 true events per. And succeeded in remembering something about 68% of these events, 49 of them. Fair enough. In other words, 68% of the true events were remembered. I can get that. The figure also shows the rate of remembering the false event, the lost in the mall business. In the booklet, only 7 of the 24 remembered. That's interesting. The partial memories included remembering parts of the event and speculations about how and when it might have happened. During the first interview, one participant reversed herself and decided she did not remember leaving 6, and that same percentage held for the second interview. I would like to say something about this right away. This research that Loftus and Pickrell invest in is interesting. It tells an interesting story with a broad generalization that people can be led to believe that they were lost in a mall. A whole cloth memory can be created out of nowhere. Well, fair enough. However, the other qualifier that one might add, and I think this is understated, and it should be stated more prominently, is that 3/4 were discerning. 3/4, even though they were so grievously deceived, you might argue, resisted and just never caved in to the suggestion that they had been lost. I think that's significant. We do want to pay attention to that quarter, which is statistically significantly above 0, but also be mindful of the prevailing discernment, if you will, the savviness, the heads-upness, as it were, of the other 3/4 that correctly rejected the false suggestion. I think that's got to be mentioned more prominently. So the true memories were correctly remembered. For 3/4 of the participants, the false memories were correctly rejected. I like that. So I think the authors, frankly, could make a bigger deal of that it's not the case that people are overwhelmingly dupable, if you will. 3/4 correctly rejected. Participants used more words when describing their true memories, whether these were fully or partially recalled, and we calculated the mean number of words using only the 29%, the 6 or 7 or so, who produced a full or partial memory in their booklets. The mean word length of descriptions in true memories was 138. For false memories, it was 50. So in that case, we had a suggestion where they strained more to recall things from the false memories, suggesting they weren't truly remembering it, you might argue. They were sort of creating something that was more labored in fashion. So 6 of the 7 subjects used more words to describe their true than false. That's good. Let's see. Oh, the mean clarity rating for the true memories of the 5 individuals that were surviving. I'm not sure why that's not 6. I might have missed something. Excuse me. Good grief. Well, there were 5 subjects remaining that falsely recalled the mall study. The mean clarity rating for the true memories of these 5 individuals was 6.3 during the first and 6.3 during the second. That's interesting. So that suggested that even though it was a false memory, they were reasonably clear. The clarity rating for the false memory, let me reverse that. The mean rating, I just said something incorrect. The mean rating for the true memories of these 5 individuals was 6.3 for the first, and 6.3 for the second. So this is something that really happened, and they were appropriately clear. However, this is interesting. Forgive me, I sort of painted myself in a corner there. The mean clarity rating for the false memory at the first interview was 2.8, but 3.6 during the second. So after a week or so had elapsed, and it might have been as much as 2 weeks, even though the memory was false, they became clearer. That may be one pernicious aspect of a false memory, is that even though what you're ostensibly remembering is not true, your subjective clarity becomes even clearer. So people just become even more ensconced in what the story that they're telling. So that clarity rating for the false memories is fascinating, going from time 1 to time 2. Here's a couple of results. I know this scan is not very hot, but here's the percentage remembered again for the true memories. Overwhelmingly, that the true memories were recalled with just greater volume. That's a good thing. We really appreciate that. But the clarity ratings are really interesting. For the true memories, both at time 1 and time 2, we have a consistent rating of 6.3. But for the false memories, among those 5 participants that were actually left, the clarity rating actually went up. And that is a suggestion that, well, clarity has nothing to do with accuracy. Here's something else then. The confidence ratings, that second dependent variable, for the true memories for this set of people was 2.7 during the first interview and 2.2 during the second. So even though the memories were true, their confidence was kind of tepid, I guess you could say. For the false memory, the confidence was 1.8 and 1.4. So it is interesting that their confidence in the memory was still measured, and it was less than that for the true memory. So one take-home message is that both for clarity and for confidence, as we saw, both of those dependent variables had lower ratings for false memories than they did for true. The other dependent variable that stood in was time 1 and time 2, and in this case for confidence, their confidence actually receded a little bit. So they had rather low confidence and even lower for time 2. However, for clarity, interestingly, that clarity actually went up for some reason. So that's a suggestion maybe of some confidence on the participants' part, or some caution, I guess you could say. Let's see what else I want to say about Loftus and Pickrell. The other idea is this notion, and this was the marquee value of the Loftus and Pickrell publication, which actually made a heck of a splash at the time it was published, was this notion of an existence proof. If I say there's such a thing as an elephant with 2 trunks, and everybody says baloney, oh no there's not, and then I produce a picture or show it live, an elephant with 2 trunks, in that case that's an existence proof, if you will. That's essentially proving that it exists. What you could argue that Loftus and Pickrell have done here, and we're reluctant to use the word proof, is they've certainly demonstrated that people can be misled and create memories from whole cloth. That can happen, and that's what this paper constitutes. I think the qualifier that the great majority correctly discerns the truth and rejects the false notion of being lost in them all, roughly 3/4, is almost as important as the existence proof, but nonetheless, I don't think we can deny a suggestion that this trend, this phenomenon, can be engendered in a rigorous lab study. I think we're going to have to concede that, and that's our existence proof. So this provides an existence proof for the phenomenon of false memory formation. In addition to the current participants and those of Loftus and Cohn, we have successfully implanted a memory, as therapists were alleged to have done at that time. So let's see if there's one other thing I want to say. Oh, by the way, Hyman and Al used a similar procedure to explore this issue. They in their discussion of Loftus and Pickrell, they say some interesting things. In their first experiment, college students were asked to recall actual events that had been reported by their parents, and one experimenter crafted false event, another pretty significant deception, an overnight hospitalization for a high fever with a possible ear infection. They were informed that they would be asked to recall childhood experiences based on information obtained from their parents. They thought the goal of the research was to compare their recall to the information of their parents, but in the first interview, participants recalled and described 62 of 74 true events, which is similar to what Loftus and Pickrell had. And in the second interview, they provided memories for 3 of the 12 events that had not been remembered during the first interview. As for the false events, and this is interesting, no participant recalled these during the first interview, but 4 of 20 participants incorporated false information in an event description during the second interview, etc. So one suggestion from the Loftus and Pickrell study and this earlier Hyman study that they describe in the article is that people are vulnerable to being essentially badgered. They deny in the first interview and then they start to cave in a little bit later. And Hyman used subtly different methods, but for what it's worth. In a separate study, let me tell you something else about Hyman. And I think I may have cited the wrong one, to try to implant 3 new false events that were rather unusual. The first was attending a wedding reception and accidentally spilling a punch bowl on the parents of the bride. The second was having to evacuate a grocery store when the sprinkler system accidentally came on. So, in that case, and I think I'm getting turned around here, I may have Xeroxed the wrong paragraph. Oh, yeah, in the first interview, subjects recalled and described 182 of 205 true events, again, doing a great job with true events. But in the second interview, they provided a bit more information, and by the third, they had provided some recall for 95% of the events. During that third interview, participants provided memories for 13 of the 23 true events that had not been remembered during the first interview. As for the false events, again, no participant recalled these during the first interview, but a quarter did by the third interview. So there are 2 studies that Hyman launched, and I wouldn't press you on the particulars of Hyman's study. Loftus and Pickrell is enough. But I think the take-home message would be here is that when people are interviewed many times, they begin to supply more information, whether they actually know that information or not, and begin to become more pliable to the suggestion of things that didn't happen. They take on these false memories. Okay, Loftus and Pickrell is pretty lengthy. Here's the last one. These results show that people will create false recalls of childhood experiences in response to misleading information. And, here's the kicker, the social demands inherent in repeated interviews. If I keep calling you in for questioning and keep suggesting things to you, you almost feel this need to placate the interviewer by caving in a little bit, by saying, oh yeah, that kind of sounds familiar. Because to continue to resist creates tension between you and the interviewer, you might argue. So, the process of false recall appeared to depend in part on accessing some relevant background information. The authors hypothesized that some form of schematic reconstruction may account for the creation of false memories. In other words, I place you at the scene, engendering memories. But also, of course, there was the aspect of having the relatives involved, which seemed to create its own strong inertia. So when they bring up schemas, by the way, and that sort of thing, if you are very experienced in going to, say, baseball games, and I had told you a story about a false story about a childhood attendance at a baseball game, you're experiencing having gone to many games might help you believe something that was false. So let's say I took you to a game when you were 5, and I tell you a story about a foul ball that hits you right in the ice cream cone as you were eating a delicious piece of ice cream. Well, we know that there are foul balls at baseball games, and sometimes they can be, move really quickly and be quite dangerous. And now these days, of course, they're starting to throw the bats in the stands. But that would be a plausible memory. They sell ice cream at the ball games and a lot of other junk food. But also, a foul ball could easily smack people right in their treat, which happens all the time. So that schema makes sense. On the other hand, that'd be much less likely to happen at a soccer game. The ball seldom goes into the stands and disrupts people. So, anyway, this Loftus and Pickrell article is, it's got some rigor to it. It's got some substance to it. It's certainly got some internal validity to it. But the thing that they would try to sell you on is that it has some external validity to it, that it has some suggestion that people can be led in these contexts for real, that in a therapy setting or in a police setting, the continued reapproach to a person, the social pressure inherent in an interview, could cause people to adopt a false memory. However, both Hyman, mentioned in the discussion, and in the main Loftus and Pickrell study, they showed that a small minority take on these memories, that people correctly reject them the great majority of the time, which I think should grab as many headlines as their existence proof as they describe it. So, following up with that, I want to mention something else about is pertaining to the reaction paper, the comprehension exercise that's due on the 1st of August, which is Monday. Peterson, Kaasa, and Loftus, that talks about implausible biographical memories that come from an early age. And there's one term that's out there in the literature called childhood amnesia. Childhood amnesia is this idea that you simply can't remember things from the earliest days of childhood. I often think of the absolute earliest memory that I think I have, and I'm pretty sure about this, was my 4th birthday, because we happened to be living in a particular place that we didn't live at very long around that time. And it was a house that we rented that had a split level. It was kind of an unusual floor design. The basement was unfinished. It was concrete floors, and it had 2 metal poles in the basement that were weight bearing. And I remember as a child just banging things against those poles to make that metallic sound. And I remember riding my big wheel down there. But I remember someone gave me a metal can, an aluminum can, I suppose, a big one, full of Lincoln logs. And the can was probably, I don't know, 2 feet tall or so, maybe more. And I remember pouring all the Lincoln logs out and putting that can on my head. And then someone else gave me a sombrero, if memory serves. I don't know why someone would give me a sombrero, but that was one of my gifts at my 4th birthday party. And that's it. It's the most fleeting memory. I have just a handful from that home that we lived in. But I think it's right. I know it wouldn't have been my 5th birthday because I lived in Connecticut at a different house for my 5th birthday. So in that case, that would be an autobiographical memory. But if I tried to tell you something about my 2nd birthday, the notion is that would be almost impossible. People just don't have the sufficient hippocampal development in their hippocampus. You're probably familiar with that brain part that's responsible for memories. And if they happen to tell you that they have a memory from that point in their life, it's unlikely to be the case that they really have that memory. So what these authors were attempting to do is see how suggestible people are in a social setting with respect to these autobiographical memories that, with all due respect to the principles, are likely to be false. So the most recent wave of research on memory distortion began with eyewitness studies, etc. Later, memory researchers were looking at other things, such as earliness of memory. So, when creating false memories in participants, researchers often target adults' memories from their childhood. One method of creating false autobiographical childhood memories has been to use direct suggestion during repeated interviews. And sure enough, 4 years prior, Loftus and Pickrell did that. However, overall, a 2004 review found that the average rate of false memory creation in studies using Lost in the Mall, 31%. Wow. So 69% are correctly rejecting it. And I know I've beaten that horse to death. Demonstrating that repeated interviews with false suggestions can influence autobiographical memory reports. And sure enough, that would stand in as that existence proof as they describe it. Interestingly, one area that has been explored in the related eyewitness literature, but has not yet been extended to the areas of false autobiographical memories, is social influence. If everybody around me is telling anecdotes, might I feel the pressure to sort of kick in and tell something that's kind of on a thin branch, not necessarily a true memory? Could social influence have the same sort of effect on memory as the suggestive interview or personal profiles? And of course, we know the Ash study about line lengths. These social influences on behavior and perception have been extended to the realm of memory. Eyewitness studies have found that the incorrect response of a confederate, in other words, a partner of the experimenter, can produce distorted recall, and this effect is referred to as social contagion of memory. So in other words, if people around me are telling a story that's not true, I may adopt that on my own. So hearing other people's stories of abuse, for example, in a group discussion context may provide indirect suggestive influences that can trigger false memories in an individual who listens to the stories. The purpose of this research is to explore, the Peterson paper, is to explore these potentially biasing effects experimentally in order to test whether simply hearing another person's recounting of a memory may be enough to produce those similar false memories. Okay, so in our current study, our participants were exposed to very early memories provided by a confederate. And again, a confederate is a partner of the experimenter that the participant thinks is just another participant. They're just sitting there and they don't appear to be a partner of the experiment. The Confederates produced memory reports that dated to a period within the infantile amnesia range, very early childhood. Confederate memories included memories of taking their first steps, their second birthday party, and being bitten by a dog at the age of 1. Again, all 3 of these memories are unlikely to be held by anybody. We're just too young. The hippocampus hasn't developed that much. If participants subsequently produced memory reports that fell within this infantile amnesia range, mimicking the Confederate, we can infer that those were improbable memories. We don't know for sure that they're false, but they're overwhelmingly likely to be false. Prior research has shown that people can be convinced to report these very early memories. The social modeling influences were hypothesized to show up with 2 dependent variables. First, participants in the experimental group were expected to state their memories came from events that occurred at a significantly earlier age than that of the control participants that weren't exposed to a Confederate. Second, participants in the experimental condition were expected to show greater confidence in their memories for the very early events, such as taking their first steps. So not only do I express that it happened at an implausibly early age, but I have greater confidence in the memory. Okay. 200 undergraduates at UC Irvine, and this is where Loftus has been working most recently. She was at UW for 35 years, were recruited to take part in a study about early memories in exchange for credit. Of these, 82% were female. So here we go again, overwhelmingly female. Just the nature of colleges these days, and it's a good thing, I suppose. Of the 200 participants, 97 were exposed to a Confederate's very early memories. The other 103 were not, so roughly 50-50. All participants were 18. Participants were recruited to take part in a half-hour session about early memory. Each session consisted of 1 researcher, 2 Confederates, and up to 2 other participants. When participants arrived, they were told that the experiment was about recall for early memories. Control participants were told that studies have shown that thinking about early memories can stimulate recall of even earlier memories, and thus they were given several minutes of silence to think about their earliest memories. In the experimental discussion condition, wherein Confederates were present, participants were told by the researcher that each person would be asked to share their earliest memory with the group, because studies have shown that talking about early memories can stimulate these even earlier memories. The researcher began the group discussion by describing her memory for her second birthday party. So before I get there, bottom line is they either tried to think of these things in silence with respect to those events, or they heard other people talking about it, the Confederates, which ostensibly stimulated things. Here's this second birthday party. My first memory is of my second birthday party. I know it was my second birthday because there were only 2 candles, and my parents made a big deal about me being able to blow them both out, like for good luck. That's mostly what I remember, the cake and blowing out the candles, but I also remember getting a wooden bench-like toy from my brother. It was one of those toys where you have these blocks in different shapes, and the bench has those holes where you try to match the blocks, etc. So not just the volume of what she remembers, but the particulars, very unlikely for age 2. The first Confederate taking her first steps. I think my earliest memory is taking my first steps. I think I was at a family barbecue because everyone knew I knew was there. But I remember that my aunts and uncles were sitting in the living room talking, and I walked into the middle of their discussion, and they were all so surprised to see me standing there that their reaction scared me, and I fell down and cried. Again, a beautiful story, but very unlikely to be a real memory. And then finally, the second Confederate, there at the bottom, bitten by a dog at the age of 1. My first memory is when I was at my aunt's house. She was babysitting me, and I was playing with the dog, and it started attacking me, and they pulled the dog off. A traumatic memory, and one could argue that you're likely to remember traumatic events more. But again, at the age of 1, we assume that the brain simply can't physically form these memories. So when they first entered the room, this is for the experimental condition, the Confederates arranged to seat themselves in an order so that they could call on Confederate 1 to go first, followed by Confederate 2, then the real participants. In this way, the researcher arranged for the real participants to always go last. Of course, they had to be exposed to this testimony or it wouldn't work. Of course, they have to go last. The researcher and the Confederate memories were scripted and memorized so that they were the same across each session. After the discussion, participants were asked to complete the early memory questionnaire packet, and while participants completed the questionnaires, Confederates simply pretended to fill out the packets to make it authentic, of course. So I hope you can understand why the Confederates had to go first in order to sell this. The questionnaire packet began with a free response measure that asked for a description of the earliest memory. Specifically, the participants were asked to describe and detail your earliest memory and include all the details that you can remember. Participants were also asked to indicate their age at the time of the event. Participants were asked to rate the clarity of the memory and how certain they were about the accuracy. So clarity and accuracy. Following the clarity and certainty questions, participants completed a life events inventory for early childhood events. They rated 27 items on a 7-point scale, with higher numbers indicating greater confidence in their memory for the event, ranging from no confidence to very confident. Sample items on this survey: I remember my first day of kindergarten, I remember my first birthday, etc. An infantile amnesia scale was created from 7 of these items that asked about events that typically occur before age 3. First steps: saying your first word, first sentence, sleeping in a crib, drinking from a bottle, being in a baby swing, and recalling your first birthday. The entire session, including debriefing, took about a half hour. But these 7 items are ones that are implausible. You're unlikely to remember sleeping in a crib and drinking from a bottle, just unless you had some unusual circumstance in which you were doing those things at a later than average age. So, first, participants who listened to the very early first memories of the Confederates reported memories that were on average a full year earlier than those who did not. That's one result, and I'm glad we don't have any numbers there, so we can just talk about it. On average, the one who were exposed to the Confederates, instead of doing the entire exercise in silence, recalled events that were on average a full year earlier than those who did not get experience to the Confederates. Also, the percentage of participants in the discussion condition who gave ages falling into the infantile amnesia range was significantly greater in the control condition. Also, let's see if I've got a repeated slide here, excuse me. And here are some things from that Peterson, Kaasa, and Loftus things. These are confidence for items on the infantile amnesia subscale in the life event inventory, the LEI. These 7 things, as they say, were unlikely to be remembered. The confidence in the discussion condition where they were exposed to the Confederates was higher, I believe, across all 7 items. Am I seeing that right? Yes. So for all 7 things, first steps, first word, first sentence, etc., the confidence was higher for all 7 of them. In other words, hearing those Confederates talk about them made me more confident in these early memories. In the discussion condition, the mean reported age was, again, nearly 1 year less than the mean reported age in the control, roughly 3 versus roughly 4, statistically significant. Gender didn't matter. Participants in the discussion condition reported a significantly greater number of memories occurring before the offset of infantile amnesia. So, more memories that happened at implausibly early ages. There were no significant differences between conditions for clarity of the earliest memory. That's interesting. So clarity wasn't affected. But then the confidence, on the other hand, let's see if I've lost my back here. Let me just go ahead and read that bottom paragraph so I don't try to summarize. There were no significant differences between conditions for the clarity of the earliest memory. On a 5-point scale, discussion and control participants rated the clarity of memory similarly. Participants were also asked to rate on a 5-point scale how certain are you that your details in the memory are correct, and the mean responses were roughly the same at 3.86. So additionally, there was not a significant difference in certainty or clarity for participants who reported a memory before age 3. So an example of an early memory provided by an actual participant. I remember being dropped off at my nanny's house at age 2 when my mother went to work. It was around 7 a.m., and she would hold me while my mom left. I threw temper tantrums, and I remember crying a lot. My mom would have to kiss me about a dozen times before she finally left, and then I was taken into the kitchen where there were other children. Me and a boy named Sammy would watch Sesame Street in there. Her house was dark and there were many rooms. I mostly stayed in the kitchen. What else can I say here? I want to mention a few other things from the results, and then we'll get on to the discussion. Participants, and I just referred to this before, participants in the discussion condition showed greater confidence. And this is what I was referring to just a second ago with this graph. So according to confidence, they were more confident in these memories. And let's see, participants in that discussion condition showed greater confidence on the 7 items that was statistically significant. To create the subscale score for each subject score was summed and then it was divided by 7, etc., to arrive at that mean. The means that discussion participants were more confident overall, this means that they were, and that they recalled events from the infantile amnesia period with greater proclivity. There were also significant differences found for the specific memory modeled by the Confederate. I remember when I took first step, participants in the discussion condition were more significantly confident that they recalled the event than control, etc., controlling for each one of those, which is kind of interesting. Not all of those were statistically significant. For instance, I've got a P of 11, but overall that confidence for those items was kind of paramount. So, to summarize, and I know this is a very involved article, this study examined the effects of social modeling on memory for autobiographical events. Specifically, participants in the discussion condition were exposed to Confederates who modeled implausibly early memories, implausibly early. In other words, drinking from the bottle, being in the crib, etc. Group discussion affected participants' own biographical memories in 3 ways. Here are those 3 ways that are paramount. First, participants who listened to the very early memories of the Confederates reported memories that were on average a full year earlier than those who didn't. Second, the effect of group discussion was not limited to the age of the earliest memory. It also extended to the recall of specific life events. When participants were asked to rate their confidence that they could recall certain early life events, discussion participants, the ones that were exposed to the Confederates, were more confident. Third, participants showed signs of being directly affected by the Confederate memories. Those in the discussion condition gave higher confidence ratings for the recall of their first steps, which is also the first memory described by the Confederate. So, a rather involved study. This study demonstrates that social influence can influence autobiographical memories, even when that's indirect. They're not speaking to the participants directly, they just happen to be in the room and they're being overheard. This is kind of like those ASH studies, where hearing others give obviously incorrect responses results in social pressure to respond in a similar way. If you're not familiar with the ASH studies, they had people judge line lengths, and sometimes those line lengths were clearly incorrect, but often people went along with the group due to social influence. In this case, it's less direct. I hear other people testify to something that's implausible, and I tend to adopt that testimony kind of as my own. So this last study, or the second to last slide I should say, that describes the findings of this article is paramount. I know it was rather involved, and frankly that's why I've limited this quiz, the objective quiz, coming up on August 2nd to just 2 articles, and each of these got their own comprehension paper with respect to the topic of false memories. So I appreciate you listening to this rather lengthy screencast, but I think they're of some use. I think it's better than have you read the articles just by yourself and prepare for these quizzes. That would be sort of a difficult thing to do. I know sometimes they're sort of dense. Well, thanks for listening, and I'll be in touch soon about the next comprehension paper.